I want to say, in the interest of transparency, two members of the Deadline White House family have been name-checked by Donald Trump. One is Mark Elias, who will join us in the next hour. The other is Andrew Weissmann, about whom he seems to not have a specific critique. He just clearly catches a lot of your appearances on television. Andrew Weissmann, any thoughts?
Well, I think that the president is not a fan of career people at the department, and I think that's where that emanates from. And I think what you're seeing with Liz's incredible story and bearing witness to it is a firsthand account of what happens when a career person speaks up and adheres to the rule of law. And I am so grateful that we have people like you, Liz, to do that. You're an extremely good company. I know there are lots of people who cheer you on inside and outside the department. You're joined by Danielle Sassoon, the former head of the Southern District of New York, by Denise Chung, the former chief of the Criminal Division, numerous members of the Public Integrity Section. And those are just the sort of public examples. You know as well as anyone just how much the career people are apolitical and just do their job. And one of the things I was struck by in your story is you're talking about the concern now of career people voicing those views and the concern about even saying anything, and even the idea that you would feel any reluctance to talk about what would happen if we put firearms in the hands of somebody who has a history of violence sends chills down your spine. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what you know about sort of the atmosphere in the department as somebody who was just recently there.
Yeah, the atmosphere is really just night and day from what it typically would be in the Department of Justice. I'm sure you know, Andrew, that conversations in meetings of DOJ component heads and senior officials are generally animated discussions, free-ranging conversation. People are often fighting for airtime because these are highly successful lawyers who have a lot to say on a lot of different issues, and they're all interested in trying to make decisions or trying to ensure that the leadership of the department is making decisions based on complete information and multiple perspectives. That has all gone away, evaporated entirely. I mean, in meetings, people are taking the seat in the back of the room. They're shrinking as far from the person running the meeting as possible, and they are quiet. The meetings are deafeningly quiet because people are afraid to speak up. They're afraid to be called out. They're afraid to be called on. They're afraid to say what they really think. I spoke with a senior colleague who expressed the view that essentially the only acceptable answer right now when somebody asks you to do something in the department is yes. You can try to say yes and or yes but if your answer doesn't start with yes, it's not going to be well received. And that is a really scary place to be in an institution entrusted with making extremely high stakes decisions about our public safety and our national security.
Vaughn, I want to bring you into this because you're there covering this for us with some of what the New York Times and our own team is flagging for us as pretty aggressive attacks on the media. Donald Trump said this, quote, "I believe that CNN and MSDNC, who literally write 97.6, not sure where he gets that figure, % bad about me, are political arms of the Democrat Party. In my opinion, they're really corrupt and they're illegal. What they do is illegal. It makes no difference how big a victory I had. I can have the biggest victory in history. It makes no difference what kind of failure the other side has. These people are going to go after me. It has to be illegal," he goes on to say. One more note that we're seeing in the print coverage, Vaughn, that I'd love for you to tell me about is that New York Times journalists have reported on some enthusiasm and cheering in the room for some of the attacks Donald Trump lobbed against the investigations into him. Tell us more.
Right. I've actually been listening for the last 45 minutes in the ear here, and I'm going to take that out for the moment. I think the part about this that you just referenced is part of a conversation that we've had, Nicole, was the extent to which now President Trump in these first 53 days in office needed to be public and audible about what he wanted from his Department of Justice. For 2 years, he ran on the campaign trail indicating what, if you were to get back in the White House, he'd want prosecutors in his Department of Justice as well as the FBI to do. 53 days into this administration here in the halls of the Department of Justice, the president has been explicit in his directives to the prosecutors that are in that room, and as you noted, who have cheered throughout his remarks here. This is not behind the scenes, without cameras running directives, but instead it is a clear, audible call for them to investigate not only journalists, to expand on what you said. It wasn't just CNN and MSNBC, but also the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, ABC, and CBS, in which he said about them, quote, "It's totally illegal what they do." And here's the part. I just hope you can all watch for it. But it's totally illegal. These people are going to go after me. This is an expansion on when he was talking about the election, the 2020 election in the room. He said, quote, "The election was totally rigged. Quote, the people who did this to us should go to jail." And then you mentioned individuals, including Andrew Weissman, who have caught the attention of him over these years. There were numerous names that he mentioned, and he said, quote, "These are bad people, they're corrupt and illegal." He then went on to talk about the role that the prosecutors actually play in this. He said, quote, "We will expel the rogue forces and corrupt actors. We will expose their crimes and conduct. It's going to be legendary. And it'll be legendary for those who expose it." Again, it'll be legendary for those who expose it. The words from the President of the United States inside of the Department of Justice to a room full of prosecutors and staff who are now 53 days in serving at his direction.
Quentin Hilliard, what strikes you as most notable? Maggie Haberman has pointed out that it is how emboldened he clearly feels.
In what he wants. I think, Nicole, here, I think our role as journalists for so long through, generations of journalists that have come before us. And I think, it hits at the heart of Watergate. It hits at even the first impeachment proceedings of then President Trump in 2019, were conversations that happened not out in public or for journalists to have access to, but it took reporters, having an understanding, having sourcing about the directives that were coming from the executive office of the president. And instead, what you have here on this March 15th day is Donald Trump making it very clear what he wants out of his prosecutors. I should also note, he mentioned the fact that Chuck Grassley, who is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, is there sitting in the room. And the likes of Michael Flynn, who folks will recall, he pardoned back in his first administration after Michael Flynn pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about his conversations with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak. And this also comes at a time in which I've had multiple conversations, and I know a great many others in our newsroom have as well, about concerns about corruption and illegal activities that take place by any of the numerous departments or agencies, not just the actual White House, but the departments and agencies. And if the Department of Justice is unwilling to investigate or prosecute those within the greater executive branch, then who is actually going to be held to account? I saw 17 inspector generals be terminated by the president of the United States in his first week in office. And so I think this stems a lot of questions when you see the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, stand there at the top of her remarks. And while talking about Donald Trump, she was very specific about saying he was the greatest president in history. He will never stop fighting for us, and we will never stop fighting for him. Those were the words of the Attorney General, Pam Bondi.
It's just such a long cry, Basil, from Don McGahn's memos as revealed through the work of the Mueller investigation in the first term, where Don McGahn clearly was putting into written memos, along with the help of his then chief of staff, Annie Donaldson, notes about how to make sure that Trump wouldn't be impeached or charged. Right. I mean, there was such cognizance of how outside the bounds, not just of norms, but of legal conduct Trump was by his first legal team. The Don McGahns and the Emmett Floods, not to lionize any of them in the annals of sort of normal political history or White House history, but compared to this, where it's completely brazen and public, replacing the rule of law with Trump's political hit list is breathtaking.
It is, and he got up at that podium and said, "It's not about we, it is about me." That's what he said. This is all about me. This is my department. This is my government. Let me just do 30 seconds on something that Elizabeth said in terms of what happened with Mel Gibson, because I think this actually bears speaking out loud.
You got more than 30 seconds.
Yeah, well,
you waited a half an hour.
If you talk to a lot of local police officers, they'll tell you that domestic calls are some of the most dangerous that they will ever face.
And the most frequent.
And the most frequent. The emotions are high, and there's access to a weapon, whether it's a knife or a gun. So for the Justice Department, Trump's Justice Department, to say, we're going to give Mel Gibson this gun back, you're not only endangering the lives of his partner or spouse, whatever the case is, you're putting the lives of the children, if there are any in the house, in danger. And the police officers, the law enforcement that enter that house or edifice, whatever it is, you're putting their lives in danger. I wonder if police unions across the country are going to be stepping in to say, this is not a good idea. I doubt it, but I hope that actually happens. Now, having said that, what's so scary is that students are being disappeared off of college campuses, right, with seemingly reckless abandon. That you have a sitting president who has closed down the enforcement mechanisms of multiple departments across government, education, AID, other agencies. But he will take a moment to stand at the Department of Justice and say, this department here is mine. I'm going to take everybody out that I don't like, replace them with the people I do want, so that all of the enforcement that occurs is at my direction. This is what folks have been talking about for a long time, for years to come. And now he's sealed the deal. And I don't know what it would take for people who, if there are any on the fence right now, to get off the fence, but this should scare you.
Last night at the Kennedy Center in D.C., the audience vigorously booing Vice President J.D. Vance. That's just part of the increasingly public backlash to Trump's second-term agenda. In North Carolina, a fiery crowd confronting GOP Congressman Chuck Edwards at a town hall event last night.
I believe that the president is very supportive of Ukraine. We should abolish the U.S. Department of Education. The decisions need to be made. Like him or not, Elon Musk has brought a lot of really smart people to Doge. I feel like this is not productive with everybody yelling at me. I mean, if you want to hear, you certainly will have the right in the next election to cast your vote based off of what you hear coming from me now.
That was inside of the venue. Outside, furious constituents chanting as well. This is the latest in a series of town hall confrontations between GOP lawmakers and voters. But the most surprising objection to Trump's policies just might be this one. Elon Musk's company Tesla sending a letter to the White House pleading for an end to the trade war, writing that Trump's actions are hurting the electric car manufacturer. Tesla joining many other American companies in adjusting their 2025 outlook due to Trump's erratic approach. It comes amid Wall Street fears about a potential recession. Compare the stock market in the first year of Trump's first term, which continued a rise that started under Obama, giving credit where credit is due. Now let's compare that to what's happening under Trump this time around amid his escalating tariffs. That is a brutal collapse. Politically, this is dangerous territory for Trump, whose allies have downplayed and deflected criticisms about the current state of the economy. The latest comes from J.D. Vance. In a new interview, Vance inadvertently echoing one of the biggest Republican gaffes of the last 2 decades, Then GOP presidential candidate John McCain claimed on the brink of the Great Recession that, quote, the fundamentals of the economy were strong.
Our economy, I think, still, the fundamentals of our economy are strong.
I think the fundamentals of the economy are actually quite strong right now.
Joining me now is Robert Reich, former labor secretary under President Clinton, and Michelle Goldberg, New York Times columnist and MSNBC political analyst. My thanks to both of you. Michelle, first, those town hall confrontations we were just looking at, they appear to be getting more intense. So what is next if the Republicans continue to run scared and they don't willingly meet their constituents where they are?
Frankly, I don't think it's just Republicans. I mean, the amount of rage and despair out there among the millions and millions and millions of people who didn't vote for Donald Trump is really hard to overstate. And they're angry at Republicans, absolutely. A lot of them are, frankly, also pretty angry at Democrats. I mean, especially today with the Senate voting to pass this really disgraceful continuing resolution. I think that there is a desperate hunger among a lot of people for new leadership. And so in some ways, you can compare this moment to the Tea Party moment, which you both saw a lot of really raucous town halls. You also saw a lot of primaries. And I think that we're heading towards both of those things.
So, Robert, what happens to the fundamentals of the economy if these trade wars continue?
The economy is already kind of unbalanced and fragile. The trade wars are bad for the economy because not only do they kind of cause every import to be more expensive and also generate retaliatory moves by our trading partners, but they also generate a lot of uncertainty. I mean, nobody knows which kinds of supplies and supply chains are going to be intact. Consumers don't know about the future. People don't know about their own jobs. So you have the combination, Katie, of not only these trade wars and the uncertainties, but also Elon Musk attacking verbally Social Security and other programs that Americans depend on for their incomes. You put those two together, and there's a great deal of fear in the American economy. I mean, a lot of consumers just simply don't know where to go, what to do. A lot of producers are putting on the brakes because they don't know where the economy is going.
So, Michelle, I want you to take a listen to what a GOP congresswoman just said when pressed on the real costs of Trump's policies. Take a listen.
What do you tell constituents when you hear automakers say that the cost of certain vehicles is going to skyrocket? It's going to jump upwards of $12,000 because of these tariffs.
Yeah. I tell them to relax. It might be a little uncomfortable, but long term, they know that this will be in their best interest.
I mean, when are Republicans going to be forced to have to reckon with this attitude, this idea that Americans just have to adjust and just be uncomfortable? I mean, it really it's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, look, when are they going to have to reckon with it? In 2026? You know, and I hope people try to keep showing up at these town halls and demonstrating their displeasure. Before then, we need protests. But ultimately, you know, this is what comes of giving trifecta power to an unelected to an unstable autocrat, and you know whose economic policies are all over the map. And there are obviously people in the hardcore MAGA movement who are perfectly willing to endure pain for the cause, but I don't think that that's all Trump voters. I think that some of them genuinely did believe the propaganda that he was going to be, that as some sort of, that as a businessman, he was going to be able to lower prices.
So, Robert, I want you to listen to Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick right now talking about the trade war with Canada. Take a listen.
Why are we doing all this business in Canada if they're not respectful, if they're not thankful?
I mean, when do we force neighbors and trade partners to have to bend the knee and kiss the ring before we continue to do business with them?
Well, it's interesting, Katie, the word respectful and thankful. We heard that with regard to Ukraine. We expect everybody around the world, every nation, to kiss our ring, to be respectful and thankful. Well, trade is not a matter of being respectful and thankful. The economy and the global economy is not a matter of respect or thanks. It's a matter of coming up with goods and services that people want and making sure that the rules of trade are fair.
There is, at this moment, I think it's fair to say, a broad frustration with what we just saw from a handful of Senate Democrats led by the leader, Chuck Schumer. Everyone from Senator Bernie Sanders to former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger and lots of people in between opposed the effort to allow Trump's continued assault on the federal government. Folks wanted to draw a line in the sand and say we cannot operate under the normal set of political rules here. And as painful as shutting down the government might be, the Democrats, as the opposition, needed to use any leverage available to them. Leader Schumer and 9 other Democratic senators saw it differently. They all voted to move to a vote on the shutdown vote to continue to fund the government. It's dispiriting. It's even infuriating to a lot of folks. But we've been saying on this program, the bulwark against tyranny in this country is not politicians. It's us. All of us in every walk of life who hold fast to the American promise of government of, by, and for the people, not the debased whims of a wannabe dictator and billionaire weirdos. No kings, not ever. If there was any good news on this otherwise bleak day, it's every single hour of every single day, folks are waking up, and there is a dawning awareness that it's time to fight back. Donald Trump's project is as clear as day. He wants to dismantle the system of self-governance and checks and balances and to create a presidential dictatorship that does not depend on the will of the people. His model is Turkey, Russia, Hungary, places where the strong man rules no matter what, and you don't get a say, whether there are elections or not. That is his goal. It's clear as day. He basically enunciates it daily. And everyone else needs to be asking, how do you stop that from happening? How can you use whatever nonviolent tools are at your disposal to stop this unlawful power grab? How can we, as Americans, as supporters of democracy and the Constitution, build a united front across ideological lines in defense of marginalized people, the ones he's coming for first, in an almost literal reenactment of the famous Niemöller poem? In defense of working and middle-class people against the pillaging of oligarchs. Heck, in defense of elites and powerful people who are using their platforms and power to preserve the American way of life. Right now, it doesn't seem like Democratic leadership understands that yet. But in many ways, and I know this sounds weird to say it right now, they are simply not what's important here. Stay focused on what's important. People are what's important. We're what's important. Public opinion is what's important. Civil society is what's important. And it's getting activated and organized every single day. Every day, the movement is growing. I mean, Republican representatives are being told to stop holding town halls because their own voters will not stop showing up to yell at them about what Donald Trump and Elon Musk are doing.
I was proud to vote recently for the House budget resolution, which provides the framework to we should abolish the U.S. Department of Education. The decisions need to be made back on the state level.
I believe that the president is very supportive of Ukraine.
Like him or not, Elon Musk has brought a lot of really smart people to Doge. And you wonder why folks don't want to do these town halls.
Wonder. The protests against Musk don't end there. There's something really remarkable happening right now. I'm not sure people have really quite gotten their arms around this. We are seeing this organic bottom-up movement against Musk's signature company, Tesla. Some activists just put up a website with a simple message, right? Sell your Teslas, dump your stock. And then an entire Tesla takedown movement has sprung up in response. And they've got a map where all the protests are planned all across the country. It's been happening for about a month. This weekend alone, there are more than 100 protests planned at dealerships, Tesla dealerships across the country, from Brooklyn to Toledo Dallas to Grand Rapids, Raleigh, dozens more. There are even, as you might see there, a handful planned in Canada and the UK. And I'm going to tell you something. I wager next weekend there will be even more, and the weekend after that more, because this is growing every single day. And it's not Democratic leadership in Congress organizing the protests. It's just everyday folks who are fed up and want to make their voices heard. And it's having an insanely outsized effect. I mean, Tesla's sales are just cratering. The stock price has seen all of its post-election gains vanish. Musk's personal wealth has declined by more than $125 billion since the beginning of the year. That's because of this. And that's why Donald Trump had to turn the White House into a car lot this week and cut an ad for his co-president's fleet of vehicles, while the Attorney General of the United States effectively tried to threaten folks with jail time if they voiced their dissatisfaction with Musk's company.
If you're going to touch a Tesla, go to a dealership, do anything, you better watch out because we're coming after you.
Wow.
And
Well,
if you're funding this, we're coming after you. We're going to find out who you are.
If you go to a dealership? No. We've all got a First Amendment right to stand on a sidewalk with signs outside a dealership. Doesn't matter what Pine Bondi says. By all accounts, this is not being funded by some big funder. It's a grassroots movement. Some people are organizing. They're putting up a website. And at any rate, it doesn't seem like those scare tactics are working. I would hazard they only make people want to protest more. Today, hundreds of veterans and their family members and loved ones rallied near Capitol Hill in protest of Musk's cuts to the federal government, many of which target veterans who worked in the government and have been fired or are serviced by the government directly. Yesterday, 100 demonstrators got arrested after hundreds more occupied the lobby of Trump Tower in Manhattan to protest the unlawful detention of the Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil. Again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's taken a little while for people to sort of understand what they're seeing, because it's shocking and it's surreal. But it's just the beginning. There's a lot more work to be done. So yes, some of the Democratic leadership is disappointing a lot of people right now. But they're elected to represent us. They're going to follow what the people do. And so we have to show them what needs doing. Faz Shakir served as a senior advisor to Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. He's currently executive director of More Perfect Union and a senior advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. Rebecca Traister is a writer at large in New York Magazine. She wrote about the shutdown fight on her Substack. They both join me now. Faz, let me start with you because, you know, I'm always very aware of the fact that in politics, particularly when it comes to sort of legislative actions and tactics, there really is a lot of backseat driving and a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking and a lot of like, you should have thrown the ball to that guy who was open. And it's like, yeah, well, it's a little harder than it looks. So I'm genuinely aware of that. I know that's true, and I've covered the Hill long enough. You worked for Harry Reid. Your advisor, Bernie Sanders. You're someone who really has lived these kinds of decisions, has seen these tactics up close. What do you think about the decision by Chuck Schumer and Senate Democrats today to vote for cloture to allow basically the Republicans to pass their bill?
So frustrated, but the reason I'm frustrated, and I think why a lot of people are, is there was no negotiating demands, no governing demands. In a normal situation, if you know you've got the votes to either pass or not pass a Republican-led effort, you compel Donald Trump to sit down with you. But you only compel him to sit down with you if you know what you want to ask for. Right. And when you're at the table and you're asking for things, you have to come up with some pretty damn popular items, and you have to govern. This is not a play dead strategic retreat. You can do it that way, and I understand why some people want to do it that way, because it absolves you of this conversation. But if you play alive and you go for it, you got to have a compelling demand. I mean, simply, I was saying no Social Security office closures in America, zero, right? No veterans clinics will be closed, zero, right? Make some demands and then say, Trump, you got to sit down with us. And now you're projecting something to America.
Yeah, that's really well put. Rebecca, you also, you sort of wrote about your frustration here. And one of the things I saw you say, and this is really, I think, ironic, is, you know, Democrats have been defenders of the filibuster because they say, look, it's sort of that door swings both ways. When we're in the minority, we're going to want to have the filibuster. Here was a cloture vote, a filibusterable bill. One of those things they need Democrats, and they just seem to kind of give that power away.
They didn't just seem to give it away. They gave it away. Here was this weapon that they claim we can't give up. We couldn't get rid of the filibuster because how else will we oppose the next administration? Okay, so you've got your weapon and you literally failed to use it. But I also want to point out that one of the reasons that I'm glad that you talked about this protest movement and the building protest movement and the ordinary people who are out on the streets. And think about what that means. Because when you're talking about those protesters occupying Tesla dealerships or occupying Trump Tower to protest the horrifying, chilling detainment of Mahmoud Khalil, you are talking about people who have other jobs, who are taking risks, who have families, who are giving up their Thursdays, their Saturdays, who are standing out in the rural red community that I spend a lot of time in Maine. You know, very conservative community, people on the street in the slush with signs and pride flags and Ukraine flags, protesting from all kinds of ideological corners. This is not their job. They are taking risks to stand up in opposition to an administration that, by the way, is threatening to classify protest as terrorism. Yes. This is the risk that they're willing to take. And the Democratic Party leadership, we know that they're not in the majority, and yet they are the only layer of powerful opposition that exists. It is literally their day job to do this kind of thing. And they did not do it. And so you have the contrast between the ordinary people out there who are taking their time, their energy to work in opposition to this truly chilling gutting of our federal government and dynamiting of our civil rights infrastructure. And then you have the people whose job it is to oppose that administration. And in some way today, they legitimized it by voting for the CR to go through. And that is devastating and enraging to me. And I believe that you're right, that it is going to be enraging to those people who are out on the streets and have been out on the streets for these past weeks and months.
Well, even Tesla, it turns out, doesn't like tariffs. That company, owned by President Trump's right-hand man, Elon Musk, has sent a letter to the administration warning that it could be affected by retaliatory tariffs from the escalating trade war. Tesla's value has been decimated by the markets. The Dow appears headed for its worst week in 2 years, even though right now, as you can see, it's up nearly 600 points. But as of last night, more than $5 trillion in value had been wiped from the markets in just 3 weeks. More money than the GDP of every country on earth, other than the U.S. and China. Joining me now is CNBC's Ron Insana, senior analyst and commentator. I'm trying to get my head around $5 trillion, Ron. Help us put that number into perspective when you're talking about a loss like that.
Yeah, so it's time to get our heads wrapped around that perspective, because this is a normal, at least for now, a relatively normal 10% correction after the market was up, Chris, 50% over the last 2 years. 23 and 24 were the best 2 year period, was the best 2 year period for stocks since 1997 and 1998. So we're seeing a 10% pullback, which on the one hand is considered normal. Remember that the market capitalization of the U.S. stock market is now about $55 trillion. So it's a pullback within the normal confines of market behavior. However, it also comes as a warning. We're seeing some deterioration in the stock market and small cap stocks, which are down 18%, and some of the big cap names that have been very popular of late have fallen more than 10%. So stock market's growing increasingly concerned about what it views as a rather chaotic and approach to policymaking that has no clear end game in sight. And so today's bounce, while probably just a technical bounce at the end of the week, doesn't mean much. The markets are growing increasingly concerned that the policies that are being put in place right now may not just be short-term pain. They could also, for long-term gain, it could be quite the opposite.
So what do you make of the fact that even Elon Musk's company, which essentially just got a bunch of free advertising, bringing in their cars to the White House, is raising red flags now?
Well, they're getting killed overseas. I mean, if you look at their European sales, I believe they were down 75% in February and down 60% in January. The stock's been cut in half from its all-time high. So that's a 50% decline. We'd call that, in any other set of circumstances, a crash in the stock. So if sales are falling overseas and you're about to be putting tariffs on goods coming in from overseas, expect retaliatory tariffs, or even, as you've seen in Canada, they're pulling American products off the shelves. You could see that type of backlash, which Elon Musk, both in the polls and in sales, is seeing for whichever unpopular moves he happens to be making on any given day.
Meantime, Vice President J.D. Vance was asked if he could rule out a recession last night. He didn't. Take a listen.
Well, look, I think you never can predict the future, but I think the economy, the fundamentals of the economy are actually quite strong right now, and we'll see how this unfolds.
We'll see. And that comes just a
Well,
couple of days.
He just admitted that the economy is strong right now, which it has been for the last couple of years. So they didn't inherit a mess necessarily from the Biden administration, as they've claimed in prior comments. But yeah, it's hard to predict the future here, Chris. It seems that financial markets.
But is that part of the problem, Ron, that they're getting these mixed messages? Is they're going to, I mean, recession, no recession, recession, no recession? We aren't getting a straight answer on what this administration thinks.
Right. And I've never seen a president or vice president come out and say, we're about to have a recession. I mean, the last time anybody did that was Jimmy Carter. And
we know how that went.
Political price for doing so. I think, though, it's somewhat disingenuous not to recognize that these policies, particularly in the way in which they're being rolled out right now, won't have an adverse, at least short-term, if not longer-term effect on the economy. As I said on CNBC yesterday, I think the financial markets are underpricing a wide variety of risks, not just on tariffs and trade, but on geopolitics and the belief in the Trump administration, and particularly by the president himself, that tariffs are a great way to raise revenue and replace income taxes, if you will, to a certain extent, and fund tax cuts. I don't think that the markets appreciate fully the extent to which the Trump administration really wants to reorder the post-World War II architecture, both in economic terms and geopolitical terms. And I think that's the big risk going forward, is that they're missing the big picture. They're selling off on this nervousness over tariffs and trade and a handful of other things. But I think in the longer run, they may have even bigger problems to deal with.
Ron Insana, always good to see you, my friend. Thank you. Joining us now is NBC's Julia Ainsley, who is outside the courthouse in Washington, D.C. Former Republican Congressman of Florida, David Jolly, an MSNBC political analyst, joins us, along with Jonathan Capehart, MSNBC host, associate editor of The Washington Post, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Julia, what are the arguments being made in court at this hour?
Well, they just started. It got underway inside Judge Nichols' courtroom. And Chris, there are two cases that are being heard in one hearing. In one case, the plaintiffs have argued that the migrants who are being held in Guantanamo need access to legal counsel. In another, they're arguing that they need a temporary restraining order to block Trump from transferring any more migrants to Guantanamo Bay. And in fact, the plaintiffs are representing in this case, they've been told there's at least a pause on transfers until Monday. The reason they're arguing this, Chris, is because we've seen Guantanamo be emptied out before. Just a few weeks ago, there were 178 Venezuelan men. They were all either deported or transferred back to the United States. They've emptied it out again. They continue to empty out Guantanamo for many reasons. One, because of the legal challenge that's happening behind me, but also because of the expense and the fact that it's not up to the code that it needs to be in order to comply with longstanding federal court settlements that say that ICE detention has to meet certain standards. And it's incredibly expensive to get it up to that standards. Even with the tents that they've built, we've told they've had a lot of problems. And the existing Migrant Operations Center isn't equipped to hold more than 50 people, and even those not in great condition. So they continue to use it, then empty it out again. But it matters, Chris, because if Trump does decide to use this further, and he might, if he invokes something called the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, if he decides to use that, he could have broad sweeping powers to use the Department of Defense resources, which includes the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. So there could be another world in which Guantanamo gets used very much more robustly to hold more people than it is right now. And so that's why these lawyers want the judge to rule on it.
All right. Thanks so much. We appreciate you, Julia. I know you want to get back into court. Jonathan, does this help Trump politically? Is that what's going on here?
Politically, in the sense that, you know, a lot of people who voted for him, and quite honestly, a lot of people around the country want something done about migrants coming over the border without papers. Do something about undocumented migration. But as I was listening to Julie's report, and especially her pointing out the expense of holding migrants at Guantanamo, and leave aside the symbolism of Guantanamo, that money could be better spent hiring more immigration judges, hiring more personnel who would make it possible for the United States government to cycle through all the backlog of cases of people who have been trying to get into the country legally, especially through the asylum system. But instead, the Trump administration and the president in particular isn't using the money that way. He's using the money in this way, which is very dramatic, very theatrical, but does nothing about solving the problem.
So let's talk a little bit more, Congressman, about the money. The Wall Street Journal has this new reporting on the mounting costs and logistical issues. And I think, obviously Julia touched on those. But let me give you just one number. Holding someone at Guantanamo Bay costs $16,540 a day per prisoner by one estimate, not including legal fees. At some point, beyond his base, does this start to not make sense to people? And Jonathan points this out. I mean, there were a lot of people who wanted our border to be secured, but does it start to not make sense?
Well, I think for part of his base, the cruelty is the point. The imagery of Guantanamo Bay and undocumented immigrants is something that probably excites the base, unfortunately. I think it's a reflection of a rather dark heart. But, Chris, I have been to Guantanamo Bay and toured it extensively. I haven't been there as a detainee, as an observer. And I can tell you nothing about this makes sense whatsoever for federal policy. It is remarkably expensive, as you just pointed out. It is an inefficient use of, or administration, if you will, of the justice system and our immigration system. The conditions are not what they need to be. You see that in the court filings as well, and particularly when it comes to access to legal representation. But I think what Donald Trump has shown us in his first 50-plus days is he doesn't care about any of that. I mean, the darkest themes of Donald Trump's campaign were around immigration, his willingness to make immigrants a target of his policies. He is not trying to attack legal immigration or just illegal immigration. He is anti-immigrant. Donald Trump is anti-immigrant. And so for him, it's almost as though he sees immigrants as a permanent underclass. And if the treatment at Guantanamo is less than what they deserve, so be it for Donald Trump. I think this is an area where the courts have some hard decisions to make. I suspect some of the courts in the process will indeed continue to stop Donald Trump. Ultimately, does this end up the Supreme Court? It very well might, because I think Donald Trump wants the imagery of undocumented immigrants at Guantanamo, and I think many in his base would cheer that on.
And the opponents of Gitmo obviously believe they have a strong case, Jonathan. I want to read part of what the original statement was from the ACLU when they decided to file. The administration is sending people to an offshore brutal prison without any legal authority or legitimate policy rationale. Put simply, this is about photo ops and theatrics. I wonder, though, does this resonate, honestly, beyond his base? There is so much going on. This whole strategy of if you throw enough stuff out there, they won't be able to keep up with it. Does it work in this instance?
Well, I would say it works in this instance because this is one of the big issues that animated the presidential campaign. But again, to the point of the story that you were just reading, and to jump off of what David was talking about, this is all theatrics. One of the other stories that's been out there that maybe hasn't gotten enough attention is the fact that ICE arrests have been lower than what President Trump has wanted, and he's extremely frustrated by that. Why? Because he's not getting the pictures and more of the drama and the theatrics that he wants in order to show his base and others that he's doing something. And again, I come back to the comprehensive immigration bill, full immigration overhaul that should have been voted on, should have passed, that would have given money to actually solve the problem of immigration in the country. Secure the border, get enough, hire enough immigration judges and other personnel that would make it possible to get through the backlog of cases that makes undocumented immigration such a problem for this country. But Republicans didn't want to do it, and certainly President Trump doesn't want to do it because of what David said at the beginning of his first answer. The cruelty is the point.
And David, these financial and logistical consequences are kind of indicative of what's become a larger issue for the Trump administration and specifically DOJ. For example, the AP is now reporting that DOJ's plan to close nearly 800 federal offices could save roughly $500 million, but that hasn't been verified. That's their number. It doesn't take into account expenses like the cost of the closures, moving spaces. It doesn't take into account if they have to get a lease on another space. What does this say about the decision-making process unfolding in the White House?
It is. Look, the level of professional ignorance when it comes to the federal budget between Donald Trump and Elon Musk is really at historic levels. Nothing they are doing will come close to balancing the budget or right-sizing the government. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And so you're talking about they are playing with about 10% of the federal budget right now that they're trying to make cuts on. And let's say they're cutting half of that. Still a big number in raw terms. But you're also not worried then about, okay, what happens when we have to replace those services? Or as you said, if we dispose of owned properties, we have to lease properties. You know, what a lot of Democrats on the Hill keep saying, and I'm not sure it has yet broken through, is watch out, because what they're really coming for next, if they're serious about cutting the federal government, is the earned benefits programs, what are sometimes called entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt. There's nothing they can do about. That's 70% of the budget, roughly, those four things. And so I don't know where the victory lap finally comes down for Donald Trump and Elon Musk, because nothing that they're doing is ultimately going to right-size the federal budget unless they have the political wherewithal to go after the big-ticket items. And what they've all suggested is they're not willing to do that, which I suppose is good for Americans, that those programs may be saved. But let's see if they actually mean that and they keep their word.